Hi, and welcome to part one of our lecture on soils. Soil you probably have a pretty good handle on. Just in general, it's defined as the relatively thin surface layer of mineral and organic, and by organic we mean something that is or used to be alive. Organic matter that can support living plants. It is relatively thin, even though in some places, like in, say, around Colombia, it seems a lot thicker than that. But over the globe, it only averages 6 inches thick, especially because there are a lot of areas with, incredibly thin soil. So let's check it out. Soil development, the creation of soil, has to start somewhere, and it starts with weathering, and that's a process we're going to look at a lot in the future that involves the breaking down of rock. It involves giant pieces of rock crumbling or through other processes becoming small pieces of rock. It can be caused by the weather, say when there's a freeze and you notice ice can split rocks up into smaller rocks, or water. If you run around in a river, you notice that there are lots of small pebbles usually on the bottom. Well, it's because the water knocks parts of big rocks off and that kind of thing. Or plants and animals, like as you can see right here, it looks like some roots are helping to turn this big rock over here into small little pieces of soil. So if we're talking about mature soil, that is mature soil that's been around long enough to develop the usual characteristics of soil, we talk about 4 different layers. On the very top, and you don't need to write this down yet because we'll get into this is just a quick preview, you've got a very thin layer called humus. Beneath that, the topsoil. Below that, your subsoil, your weathered rock down here. Those are your 4 layers of soil. And other people will break this down into more layers with sublayers and that kind of thing. But this is a good start for us. And on the bottom, this is just pure rock, the bedrock. And so that doesn't really count as soil. But it is a layer down at the very bottom of everything. So the top layer is humus. And this is a nutrient-rich, decayed organic material. You can see it in this photo. You've seen it around. It's just the old kind of decayed leaves and twigs and branches and little small animals and that kind of thing that's breaking down into fine, rich, good-smelling dirt. Usually there's going to be an inch or two of it just scattered across the top of the land in places where there's fertile soil, there's good vegetation. You can probably see it out in your yard if you go outside. Beneath that is the topsoil. This is generally brownish. It's home to most of the plant life. There are a lot of really great things in it for creating and sustaining life. Bacteria, the roots of plants, earthworms, which are always a great sign of there being really good soil somewhere, and a lot more humus, which kind of is a part of the topsoil, even as humus is its own layer above the topsoil. One thing about about topsoil, though, is that these nutrients are leached out of it through a process called leaching, in which water carries the nutrients down because water likes to go to float downward. It carries them down from the topsoil to the layers below, which means that the third layer, the subsoil, is going to have some of those minerals that leach down from the topsoil. In this picture on our right, it looks pretty red, and that's because there's a lot of iron in it. Those minerals have come down from the topsoil to the subsoil. Subsoil can also have some roots, and you can see a couple in there. Fine soil particles. It often feels kind of like clay to some extent because the smaller particles will sift to the bottom. It's kind of like in a cereal box. The crumbs always go to the bottom of the cereal box if you shake it up. Same thing with soil. Small things find the little cracks and crevices that will allow them to drift downward like gravity wants to take them. Beneath that, you have the weathered bedrock. This is the last layer of real soil before you get to the bedrock itself. Now, the weathered bedrock has some leached minerals, but mostly it's just it's non-fertile soil, and pieces of large rock that are in the process of weathering into smaller rocks, into soil. There aren't many plants, aren't many animals that live here. And you can see it to the right. This area right here is kind of the weathered bedrock. A lot of larger rocks that are coming off of the bedrock beneath everything. This is the bedrock is the solid rock that makes up most of the Earth's crust. And when, say, you're digging a house, you're making its foundation, a lot of the time the foundation is going to be on solid bedrock, because that's very, very stable. And if you're trying to dig into the bedrock, well, then you've got a problem, because it's going to be really, really hard and your shovel's going to break. So those are different layers of soil, but how do they get there? We need to talk about soil creation. And for this, there are 4 different factors that are really going to be important. And the first one is the parent material, the stuff it came from, the bedrock that was weathered down into these small pieces of soil. Because the soil is going to reflect the characteristics of the bedrock that broke down to create it. So sandstone, for instance, which is a hard rock, is going to break down into kind of sandy, coarse-grained soil. On the other hand, slate is a different type of rock. It's going to break down, if you weather it, into finer particles, and so the soil will reflect that if that's where the soil comes from. And the parent material is the most important factor when it's really new soil, because it's come fresh from the bedrock, and so then it'll really resemble the parent material. But as the soil gets older, other factors will influence it more, so it might take on other characteristics that separate it from the parent material. And I guess it's kind of like a metaphor for you, because, well, all of us, because, we're most like our parents probably when we're young, and the older we get, the more different influences might change us or make us different. The second big factor in soil formation is the climate. The high temperature, being really hot, having lots of moisture, these factors make the process of soil formation happen very quickly. So where the climate is hot and humid, you're going to have very deep soils. But there's a caveat here, because water, the moisture, leaches nutrients away. Really hot, humid areas are always at risk of losing their nutrients if there isn't a lot of vegetation to kind of keep the nutrients circling. So here's a rainforest. You can see below really deep soil, but the nutrients that are present in the trees need to be broken down quickly and used and turned right back into more vegetation. And if they're not, if, say, the vegetation is chopped down, if there's deforestation, then there won't be anything to hold the nutrients in the soil, and the soil will really quickly lose its fertility because there's so much rain. So that's one of the reasons that deforestation in tropical regions is so potentially dangerous for that soil. It can just lose all its nutrients and all of a sudden be good for nothing. So don't chop down rainforests. The topography is a really important factor, and topography is just a long word that means the shape of the land. Erosion is an important process that will come into play here, and this is the process of moving rocks around. It's when wind and water basically move weathered rocks to new places, and you see it when there's a dramatic example is a landslide. That's a huge example of erosion. And so why do we care about this process? Because the topography of the land is going to create areas where there's slope, where there's hills, and areas where it's more flat. And where there's a very steep slope, you have a lot of erosion because your gravity is more able to pull rocks and soil down away from where they were. And that means that erosion is going to be happening faster than the new soil is going to develop. So the soil is going to be very thin, and you've probably noticed this yourself. That a lot of the time on hills, you see like rocks sticking out, and there's not good soil for things to grow. On the other hand, flat areas, there isn't a lot of erosion, so the soil has a lot of time to build up to great depth. So places like the Great Plains, which are very flat, are going to have really deep soils, and that's one reason that the Great Plains are so fertile. There's just not much erosion, so the soil can build itself up. And finally, plants and animals. Plant roots and earthworms and burrowing animals like groundhogs and hedgehogs and prairie dogs. And I looked up a whole bunch of these. Some of them are really ugly, but these guys are cute. These prairie dogs. They churn up the dirt and kind of mix it around. They keep it from forming too tight layers, which would be bad for plants being able to get lots of different nutrients. They aerate the soil, so air can get in and water can get down to lower levels when and where it needs to. They die, which is really good for the soil. Eventually, hopefully, they have nice long little prairie dog lives first, during which they poop a lot, because when they poop, that also really helps. That helps kind of make the dirt more fertile. And there's a lot of bacterial activity involved with that as well, just breaking down organic matter and that kind of thing, which also help provide the soil with nutrients. Whew! So that is part 1 on soils. Good job. It's a long lecture.